Modern gaming sucks, huh? I mean, these games and consoles are so expensive, these companies are so greedy, raising the prices on everything. Don't you want to go back to a time when these issues didn't plague the industry? Well, that's impossible. Not just because time travel is impossible, but also because the industry's always been like this. Case in point, Atari.
In the modern gaming landscape, the industry is ruled by four giants: Nintendo, PlayStation, Xbox, and Valve. For the past 20 years, they've remained the dominant suppliers of many video game experiences. Due to each of them appealing to audiences in their own way, they live in harmony to a point where many don't even see them competing. I own a PS5, a Switch 2, and a Steam Deck, and I play them all fairly equally. I'm not loyal to a single company because each one of them provide me something different. These four companies have been ruling the industry for so long, it's weird to think back to a time when none of them were around. But about 50 years ago, that was the case. In fact, 50 years ago, there was a single titan that towered above all others, and they were known as Atari.
Not only did they rule the industry back then, they practically created it. Everything gaming has been and will be all dates back to this one company. And yet in the modern day, over 50 years later, this company is practically irrelevant. So how does that happen? How does a company go from ruling an entire industry to becoming pretty much irrelevant to its modern audience? Well, this is the story of Atari.
Our story begins in the mid-1960s at the University of Utah. It's important to remember that this was a time before video games were a consumer product. As a matter of fact, computers weren't a consumer product yet either. They were massive, expensive, and a commodity for bigger institutions, which is where our story begins. Nolan Bushnell was attending the school at the time, studying electrical engineering.
And I feel I need to preface this with the fact that it's unclear how true this story actually is, as many think this is over-exaggerated or even partly fabricated, but this is the story Bushnell tells himself, so it's what I'm gonna go with.
A friend introduced him to a computer game, Space War. Despite the game's simplicity, it was eye-opening to Bushnell. While others saw it as nothing more than a little computer game, Bushnell saw something else in it: potential. Potential to be more than just a little computer game. The potential for it to be a profitable game.
Unfortunately, especially at the time, computers were far too expensive for this to be a profitable venture. Bushnell still believed that video games could become a part of American culture and a staple of leisure time. However, it was still too early for this to be a reality.
However, in the following years, things changed, as computer parts became cheaper the more the government used the technology, and eventually, it reached a point where this technology could be used in a commercial machine. So in 1970, Bushnell began developing a game with Ted Dabney. The game was heavily inspired by Space War, and in 1971, they founded their company as Syzygy Engineering, named after the term for the sun and moon aligning. Interestingly enough, foreshadowing for how much Atari would focus on space. And of course, we saw that with their first game, Computer Space. And this was the first ever commercial video game, which is kinda sorta a big deal. Computer Space was a simple game that looked like a primitive version of Asteroids. You play as a spaceship and have to shoot another while avoiding its shots.
It's a simple game and was a fine enough success, but it wasn't the runaway hit that Bushnell and Dabney were hoping for. However, it wouldn't be too long until they had that.
But before that happened, another important thing happened. As I said, they founded their company as Syzygy Engineering, but we don't know them as such these days. So how did that come about? Well, in the summer of 1972, they went to incorporate their company in California. There was an issue though. The name Syzygy was already taken. So they named the company Atari. Atari is based on the Japanese word ataru, which means to hit a target or succeed.
It's like they were trying to manifest success, and, well, it did work.
Their next game released the same year, and I'm sure you've all heard of it before. It's a little game called Pong. And while Computer Space was the first commercial video game, Pong was the first game that proved there was actually a market for an industry. Funnily enough, Bushnell and Dabney didn't really have faith in the game. They mainly just made it to get something out because they needed to make money. However, it became far larger than they anticipated.
Now I'm going to bring up another story that potentially seems to be exaggerated as well, but it's a fun story, so I'm going to tell it anyways.
One of Pong's first test units was put in a tavern for a weekend. However, that Friday night, they received a call that the machine stopped working and they wanted it removed. So the game's designer, Al Alcorn, went to check out the machine and of course tried to play it. So he tried to insert a quarter and it wouldn't fit. So he opened up the coin box and found that it was so full of quarters the machine couldn't accept any more. So the machine wasn't broken, It was actually so popular, it was so full of quarters that no more could fit.
True or not, it's a great story, and I believe it highlights what made Pong such a success.
Pong is one of the easiest games to understand. 2 bars and a ball. You rally the ball back and forth, trying to not let the ball slip past you. It's a simple game, but I believe that simplicity is what made it a success. It's a game that anyone can easily understand and find fun. The control was just a knob that you twist to control the paddle, and for only a quarter, it was a fun game to play with a friend while at the bar. This is where most of the machines were, but Atari knew that they could make even more money if they could get it into places where kids could easily access it too. They made other versions like Puppy Pong, which were designed for waiting rooms, and this helped make Pong even more of a success. They sold thousands of units and also showed businesses how profitable video games could be. The way these are sold was a company would buy a machine from Atari to put in their space. Each game cost a quarter to play, and when the money was received, Atari and whatever company had the machine would split the profits, making it a profitable venture for both parties.
Pong showed that Bushnell was right. Video games could be a profitable venture and become a part of American leisure. So in the following years, they made more games. However, they weren't as successful.
There were games like Space Race, Gotcha, which received some backlash due to its provocative marketing, but these games didn't succeed in the same way that Pong did. But it didn't matter too much, as Pong was still raking in a ton of money and distributors wanted more games, and they even wanted exclusive games that only they could provide.
So what did Atari do to ensure they could create exclusive games but still sell those games to other distributors? They made a second company and poisoned them as a competitor. No, I'm not kidding.
Key Games was founded by Joe Keenan, and he worked closely with Bushnell to create similar games to Atari to sell to other distributors. As a matter of fact, some Atari developers were sent to work for Key Games. It's weird to think that Atari created a competitor who they were secretly aligned with to sell more machines, but it was a profitable venture for both companies. This didn't last too long though, as in 1974, Atari acquired Key, seemingly ending this competition. Other than that though, 1974 didn't see a lot from Atari. Pong continued to sell like hotcakes, they had their fake rivalry with Key, and they also created Touch Me, a less conventional sound-based game that would play sounds and you had to press the buttons in the right order. You may wonder why I even bother mentioning this, but that's because this was the game that went on to inspire Simon Says.
Now we're 5 years into Atari's life and there still hasn't been a home console yet, which is weird because that's debatably what they're most well known for. However, in 1975, they would dip their toes into that market.
For the 1975 holiday season, Atari worked with Sears to release Telepong, a home console that could only play Pong. Nice. Well, it was a decent enough success and showed Atari that there was potential in the home console space, and in the following years they would continue to produce and release various Pong consoles. In 1976, another notable game was released, Breakout. Weirdly enough, this game was actually designed by Apple's founders Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. It was kind of like Pong where you controlled a paddle and rallied a ball, this time to destroy blocks. This was yet another big success from Atari, but not the biggest thing to happen to the company. The same year, they were acquired by Warner Communications for $26 million, which is about $150 million these days, not too much. Now this may seem a bit confusing. Atari was clearly having some success with multiple successful arcade games and some Pong consoles. Why would they accept being bought out? Well, they wanted to make a dedicated home console, but didn't yet have the money to do so. But being acquired by Warner Communications would help them fund the system.
However, this decision, in a way, led to the death of Atari. Warner saw Atari as something different. They saw the potential of video games, and so they were gonna milk it in a bad way.
Ray Kassar became the CEO, but he was widely disliked by its employees, and longtime employees noted that under his leadership, Atari seemed like nothing more than a cash cow.
The following year, Atari would further revolutionize the video game industry with the release of their first true home console. But before I talk about that, I also want to go over some of their other notable arcade games.
Super Breakout was a special version of Breakout with a few new different game modes, making it the best version of Breakout, and Lunar Lander saw the introduction of something huge, well, for us people who care too much, vector graphics. The game was made up of crisp white lines, not just blocks. It gave these games a very distinct visual look that, to me, makes it look more iconic. And Lunar Lander itself is a classic. You control a, well, lunar lander attempting to land on the moon. Steering and propelling it, you're trying to safely land the spacecraft. It looks easy, but it can be pretty tricky, which makes it the ideal arcade game. It's definitely one of my favorites of theirs, and another one of them being Asteroids. Another vector-based game, you control a ship and have to avoid asteroids while destroying them and enemy ships. A simple game, but an absolutely iconic one. Another classic is Missile Command, born from the lingering fear of nuclear annihilation during the Cold War. How fun! Missiles rain down from the sky and you have to defend your cities by blowing them up midair. Absolutely iconic. Like Centipede, a creature slowly makes its way towards the bottom of the screen and you have to shoot each part of it before it reaches the bottom. There's all these mushrooms on the field that can block your shots, and every piece of the creature you kill turns into a mushroom. While it's not my favorite, it's still one I really enjoy. Now, Tempest is a really cool vector game where I don't even know what you're doing. I just think it's cool that Atari made so many unique variations of shooters set in space.
I could go on about more of their arcade games, but I feel that I've mentioned most of the important ones, because really, what else is there to say about Food Fight?
But I do want to mention their last arcade game released in 1984, iRobot. This was the first game to use 3D polygonal graphics, and it's cool to see that until the end, Atari was innovating with their arcade games. After iRobot's release, Atari sold off their arcade division to focus on other endeavors.
But we're way ahead in the timeline right now, so let's pop back to 1977 and see how they revolutionized the industry more.
We all know what happened in 1977. Atari released their first console that used interchangeable cartridges, the Atari VCS, later known as the Atari 2600. Due to all the competition their pawn consoles faced, Atari wanted to release a home console that could do something those couldn't: play hundreds of games. Instead of having the game data stored within the console just contained the technology that could read ROM cartridges and play whatever data was on said cartridge. This wasn't an entirely new concept, as the Magnavox Odyssey technically also had interchangeable carts, but the VCS had hundreds of unique games made for it. The design of the console is so iconic. The wood grain piece on the front with a nice silver Atari logo, the rich designs across the top, all the switches. It's a very classy looking system. The controller, on the other hand, I mean, it works. A stick and a button, it works for most games, but it is weird that the console was designed with only a stick and a button. That meant any game made for the system that required more buttons needed extra accessories, and of course that would just add on to the cost, which let's talk about. The VCS was released for $200, which sounds like a decent enough price these days, but adjust for inflation and oh boy. Of course, inflation isn't always the best way to calculate how much something truly costed back then, but I think it at least shows that home consoles have always been pricey investments. These have always been luxury products, and you know what's crazy? Even though the console was expensive for its time, Atari still sold them at a loss. Their idea was they'd make up the loss in software sales, and well, that's what happened.
Since the VCS used interchangeable cartridges, the console on its own didn't make its legacy. It's the games that did.
The VCS came with a cartridge, Combat. This was a multiplayer-based game, well, kind of multiple games. There are 27 different game modes, which boil down to 4 different versions, each with various layouts and environments. And you controlled a vehicle and competed to see who could shoot each other the most. That's it. It's a pretty simple game, but a fine enough pack-in, especially since it's multiplayer-focused. This showed that this console is something that can be shared by the family, so if a mom buys this, boom, present for both of your ungrateful kids. But for people looking to play Atari alone, there was Air-Sea Battle. This had some single-player modes, and get this, you fire missiles in the air and sea. It's a fine enough time, but obviously not too much to say about it. A lot of these games were like this, very multiplayer-focused, often with single-player modes, but it's usually very apparent these games were designed for multiplayer, as the single-player modes are a bit awkward, but they're enough fun. I don't know if they justified buying the console for them, but clearly the public disagreed, as during its life, it sold 30 million units.
Now these days, 30 million may not seem like too much, especially considering that these days, it's pretty common for many consoles to sell over 100 million units. But let me put it into perspective this way. The series consoles have sold a combined 28 million consoles in 5 years, which means they still have yet to outsell the 2600. Does it seem like a lot of people own an Xbox? Because more people owned a 2600.
This console truly was the first major success in home console gaming, and it showed that it was just as in demand as arcade games. It makes sense though, every time you play an arcade game, you pay a quarter to play for as long as you can last. That meant you could easily drop dollars upon dollars on a single game. So for $20 to $30, why not buy one of those games that you could play at home as many times as you want? Home consoles connected with consumers, and we have the VCS to thank for that. But the VCS wasn't perfect. It had one fatal flaw, that being that its technology couldn't evolve. Each game made had to run on this specific hardware. This was different to arcade games, which had boards designed to run each game. Each board was manufactured specifically with that game in mind, which meant that there wasn't too much of a limit of what developers could do. But for VCS games, all of these games had to run on this specific piece of hardware, and it was not a powerful piece of hardware by any means. I mean, look at how big the chip is. It's not very big, is it?
And this is where some of the trouble with the VCS came from. They had to port these giant arcades to it, which was possible, but it came with significant losses.
Missing stages, hazards, some games barely resembled their arcade counterparts. We laugh at Pac-Man and Donkey Kong on VCS because look at how bad it looks. But when you think about the fact that they had to develop these games for such limited hardware, it's much easier to respect these games for what they were and also feel some distaste for the uppers at Atari who forced the developers to do all of this. Working for Atari in this time wasn't very fun. Sure, they were making smash hit games, but the developers weren't getting credit for it. They weren't being financially compensated either, regardless of the fact they were raking in the dough for the company. Eventually, in 1979, a group of employees had enough of this and decided to leave, forming their own company. And this company was Activision. They made their own VCS games, but released them themselves, ensuring they got the credit and money they deserved for making these games. This was another revolutionary event for the industry, as Activision was the first company, aside from Atari, to develop games for the system. This was the birth of the third-party developer, which is what most modern consoles live off of. However, this was a double-edged sword, as this led to an increase in games on the console, which led to less quality control. Any company could make games for the system, and that made it to where consumers didn't know what was quality and what wasn't, what was worth their money or what was just fishing for their money.
It would be a few years before this really affected the console and industry as a whole, but it all started here with the birth of Activision.
1979 was a big year for Atari, as in the same year, the VCS's first competitor hit the scene, the Intellivision from Mattel. Now it came nowhere near the level of success the VCS saw, but it did show that other companies were out for that home console dough. But Atari branched out further this year as well, as they launched their first two home computers, the Atari 400 and the Atari 800. These were the first ever gaming computers, and looking back, they're pretty cool machines. Power-wise, they were pretty similar, but the 800's RAM could be expanded, which made it the higher end model. But of course, they had both, the 400 for more casual users and the 800 for more hardcore users. These were many's first true home computers, and Atari was very smart with how they designed them. See, most home computers required a dedicated monitor, which increased the price more. However, these computers could hook up to your TV, which meant you didn't need an expensive monitor. This made it much easier for consumers to invest in these machines, which was required because these were insanely expensive, especially for the time. The 400 was $500 and the 800 was $1,000, which to this day is insane. I mean, I'm not even gonna bother adjusting for inflation.
Well, if they're that expensive, then they've gotta be top of the line products, right? Well,
the 400 has a membrane keyboard, which reportedly didn't work too well. It's a very weird thing. I assume it relied on pressure, but it's such an unconventional keyboard, I would hate using this thing. The 400 has only one cartridge port, while the 800 had two. Ooh. It also had a much more conventional keyboard and is definitely overall the better model. Functionally though, they could both do the same set of things. Tell you information like what's going on in the stock market or what the sports game score is, play educational software, play game software, and program your own software. For a computer from the late 70s, these do seem pretty cool, and them being able to do all of this definitely showed the worth of home computers in general. It's something everyone in the family could get use out of, which definitely made it easier for many families to pick one of these up to share.
So now Atari was juggling the VCS, arcades, and home computers. I'm sure this will continue to go well for them.
In 1980, another important game for the VCS released, Adventure. Going back to it, it is such a primitive adventure game, but there's a lot of charm in its simplicity. It's weird because it's just a bunch of weird blocks and colors, but playing it, you start to find similarities to, well, The Legend of Zelda. You're exploring this confusing world with not much to guide you, just trying to make your way to the treasure, avoiding all the creatures out there and trying to kill you. It's very hard to understand what's going on in it these days, but you can at least see the groundwork for adventure games as a whole, which is really cool. This game truly showed off what the VCS was capable of if developers pushed it to its limits. Another cool thing about it is that it was technically the first VCS game to credit its creator, and Atari didn't even attend for that. In this era, they didn't state who made these games, which was part of the reason why that group of developers left to form Activision. So knowing that Atari wouldn't credit him for his work, Warren Robinett hid a credit for himself in a secret room within the game. Funnily enough, later on, Atari treated this as a fun little Easter egg, but I know they were mad when they saw this. It's crazy to think because these days, many games begin with names upon names of the many people who worked on these games. They kept that shit secret, which is one of the many things about Atari under Warner's rule that was incredibly lame.
This leads to our next big story of our next big game, Missile Command.
Missile Command received a port to the VCS the following year, and it's easily my favorite game on the platform. Missile Command is a simple enough game to where it does work incredibly well on the system. It's of course not one-to-one with its arcade counterpart, it is a more simplified version, but it's still a good version. And it was a massive success, selling around 2.5 million copies, making it one of the best-selling games on the system. It was developed by Rob Fulop, and what did Atari do to reward him for creating such a big success? They gave him a coupon for 1 free turkey. I'm not kidding. Thanks for making us $1 million. Here's a $5 turkey.
Like at that point, just give him $5 and let him buy some crack with it or something, I don't know.
Yeah, needless to say, he left Atari after, and these stories definitely highlight what it was like working for Atari at the time. Warner didn't value their developers, they didn't credit them, they didn't compensate them. When they were making these games all by themselves, then went on to make the company a lot of money. It really sucks to hear because these are the people who helped shape the industry. They created some of the most iconic games of all time, and they went underappreciated for years.
I am thankful that in the modern day, these people are always recognized for their work because it is very well deserved, but how Warner treated Atari's employees is just one of the many straws that would go on to break the camel's back.
1981 also saw the release of Asteroids for VCS, and it's a competent version. It's not as good looking, of course, you can't really beat vector graphics, but this is a more serviceable way to play it. There is also Haunted House, which is considered the first ever horror game. I think the horror comes from how bad it is. It's kind of like Adventure, where you have to find items to progress, and like Adventure, I never know what I'm doing. And speaking of games where I don't know what I'm doing, Yar's Revenge. Now this is, weirdly enough, considered one of the best VCS games. It was developed by Howard Scott Warshaw, and he did with this game something that at the time was new and risky, but it paid off. Originally, he was asked to port an arcade game, but after working on it for a bit, he didn't feel that it translated well. Instead, he wanted to make something original. A game that you would find in an arcade, but could only actually be found on the VCS. Enter Yar's Revenge, I don't even know what to explain it as, but this was one of the first games ever made to have an actual story to it. Warshaw wrote a whole ass background story to the game, which turned into a comic book included with the game, which at the time was unheard of for games. Some of them may have had a very basic background story to them, but Warshaw created an actual narrative story that led to the events of the game. A whole story to contextualize this. You play as this ship, this is Yar, and he's getting revenge on this. Blast away the blocks protecting it, approach the center, aim the shot, miss, and die. I love this game.
Regardless of how confusing it is at first, Yar's Revenge is a very important game. As I said, it was one of the first games to have a whole story to it, and it also launched the career of Howard Scott Warshaw, who would go on to design another iconic 2600 game. And I don't really mean that in a good way, but we'll get to this later.
In 1981, Atari was on top of the world. They ruled the industry they created with an 80% share of the home video game space and had made over $1 billion. But the following year, 1982, would be one of the biggest years in Atari history, and not in a good way. At this point, the Intellivision was competing with the VCS ferociously. They really loved doing side-by-sides with Atari to show that they were the superior product. And one thing they used as examples were Atari sports games. They showed how much more true to life Intellivision sports games were, and so Atari had to strike back. So bring in the Real Sports series, a new series of sports games more accurate to their real life counterparts. To be fair, these games were far better than the original sports games. They still aren't good, don't get me wrong, but some like tennis are actually somewhat competent.
But in this era, Atari was dead set to stomp out the flames of competition, and one thing they did in this time was the most ambitious thing they ever attempted.
Enter Sword Quest, an ambitious series of 4 puzzle adventure games. But these were more than just simple games. They were to be massive events. Each game was a competition, and the winners of each would receive a high value prize, each worth $25,000. And once the 4 prizes were given out, the 4 of them would return once more for one final competition where the ultimate winner would win a $50,000 sword. The first game in the Sword Quest series released this year, Sword Quest Earthworld. As I said, it was a puzzle adventure game. You traverse different rooms, each room having different objects, many requiring you to complete little mini games. games. As you progress, random numbers would flash on screen which corresponded to a comic book that came with the game made by DC Comics. These numbers would lead you to find hidden words which lead to the treasure. Everything went according to plan with Earthworld, and Stephen Bell ended up winning the first prize, and the series was set to continue in 1983. Until then though, Atari had more fish to fry.
1982 also saw the release of the ColecoVision, which was far more powerful than the VCS and showed Atari that they were going to need new hardware in order to compete more effectively.
But this was still the early years of home console gaming. Atari was unsure of how they should compete with the growing competition. Should they double down on the VCS, create a new system? Well, they ended up doing both. This was when the VCS was renamed to the 2600, and they also began developing a new system. However, development of said system ended up being really messy. The 5200 was a system designed around competing with the Intellivision. Marketing wanted the console to be huge to give it perceived value, and they wanted the controller to have a number pad on it because the Intellivision has it too, but also make sure that there are more buttons because we're better than the Intellivision. The developers didn't like this. They petitioned against this controller because they knew their games didn't need this many buttons. It was excessive, unnecessary, and marketing was taking away the wrong idea from Intellivision. A great quote from one of the developers is that if you've got a bad control mechanism, doesn't matter how good the graphics are, it's not gonna be fun to play. And not only were these controllers unnecessarily full of buttons, they were also incredibly faulty, needing to be replaced sometimes twice a year.
But whatever needs to be done for marketing, right?
Also, the developers told marketing they could make it compatible with 2600 games, which would make sense. If you're gonna release a new, more powerful system, may as well make it able to play your old games so you can justify buying the new thing more. But marketing said no. Why would consumers want to play their old games on their new systems? Better yet, they need to buy them again, so they didn't add 2600 support. Except 2 months before launch, marketing said, hey, we want 2600 support.
What the fuck, you guys?
So they rushed together this thing, an adapter to play 2600 games, and the developers hated it, calling it a piggyback parasite. And I think this console development is a beautiful omen to the failure it was. Being dominated by marketing, the developers were forced to make it bigger, but they weren't allowed to focus on the games, the things that actually sold the console. The 5200 came packed in with Super Breakout, which was definitely better than the 2600 version, but not better enough to justify buying a whole console for. Star Raiders also launched with the system. This was a port of the Atari 400-800 game, and it made sense to bring it over since the 5200 is basically the 400-800 repackaged as a console. Anyway, Star Raiders is actually a great game. It's a space simulator where you just fly around to different sectors, defeating enemies. To this day, it works very well and is actually a surprising amount of fun. I love booting this one up from time to time. Anyways, it's November 1982, and there's a lot of exciting stuff for Atari. The Real Sports series, the Sword Quest series, the 5200, and in November, a tie-in game for Raiders of the Lost Ark released, designed by our old pal Howard Scott Warshaw. It was a decent success, and apparently Spielberg asked Warshaw to adapt his newest film, E.T., next, and Atari jumped at this. They believed this was their big holiday title for 1982, so Warshaw had 5 weeks to make it. In that time, he worked 500 hours to get the game done by the deadline, and he did, and the game went on to be widely considered the worst game ever made. It was a disaster, both critically and commercially.
This game and year as a whole was a turning point for Atari as everything was downhill from here. However, that is a different discussion for a different day. Until then, I have a question for you. Have you played Atari today? Probably not, because everything I showed today was like nothing special at all. I mean, be honest with me. Did you see Air-Sea Battle and say to yourself, wow, a VCS is only $60? Well, then again, a VCS is only $60. No, I need to not make a bad financial decision. Oh, wait, I already have. Thanks for watching, and good fucking Nicus.